Imagine a world where every screen goes black, every bank account vanishes, and the lights of civilization go out forever. This is the Great Decoupling. It wasn't an explosion or a war. It was the moment the Earth simply unplugged humanity, forcing us to trade our digital dreams for the soil beneath our feet. Somewhere in the vastness of the cosmos, a silent wave of magnetic energy swept through our solar system, permanently altering the way our world interacts with the invisible forces of physics. In a single heartbeat, the fundamental laws of electromagnetism shifted just enough to render our modern world a graveyard of glass and copper. Electrons, the tiny workers that powered our entire civilization, simply stopped moving through the long, thin wires we had spent centuries weaving across the continents. Every battery, from the smallest cell in a heart monitor to the massive arrays powering our cities, drained into nothingness. The world went out like a flickering candle in a sudden wind, and for the first time in ages, the stars began to reclaim the sky. In the heart of Dubai, a city carved out of the shifting sands by sheer will and infinite capital, the tragedy took a golden hue. High above the desert, on the 150th floor of a shimmering spire he had built himself, a man awoke to a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight. He was the owner of the world's most expensive duplex, a palace of glass and Italian marble suspended in the clouds. But as he reached for the light switch, there was no spark. He turned the gold-plated faucet, and only a hollow, metallic gasp echoed through the room. Without the massive electric pumps to fight gravity, the water had retreated back to the earth, leaving his kingdom parched. In that single, terrifying heartbeat, the man realized he had become a prisoner of his own dreams. His skyscraper, once a symbol of his ascent above humanity, was now a vertical tomb. The desert sun began to bake the glass walls, and with no air conditioning to repel the heat, his sanctuary became a furnace. He looked at his smartphone, a useless relic of a dead era, and then at the 150 levels of stairs that lay between him and survival. The descent was a brutal, bone-breaking odyssey. With every flight of stairs, he shed a layer of his former identity. By the 50th floor, his lungs burned with the dry air. By the 100th, his designer shoes were ruined, and his legs trembled with a weakness he had never known. By the time he pushed open the heavy emergency doors at the ground level, he was no longer a billionaire. He was a broken man gasping for breath. In the colossal hubs of human ambition like New York, London, and Tokyo, the tragedy was one of profound and immediate helplessness. Imagine the scene at a high-end restaurant in the center of Manhattan. Patrons sat at candlelit tables, but the candles were no longer for ambience. They were the only thing preventing total darkness. The master chefs, who had spent decades perfecting molecular gastronomy using high-tech ovens, found themselves staring at useless stainless steel. Outside, the streets became a labyrinth of frozen machinery. Hundreds of thousands of electric vehicles died exactly where they stood, turning the highways into stagnant rivers of colorful metal. At the banks, the ironies were even more bitter. Men in expensive suits, who controlled billions in virtual assets, stood before ATMs that had become nothing more than heavy, rectangular paperweights. They tried to swipe gold and platinum cards, objects that only hours ago represented ultimate power, but the machines remained cold and silent. Wealth had evaporated because the record of that wealth existed only in a digital dream that had finally ended. In the high-rise apartments, the silence was deafening. Without electric pumps, the water stopped flowing to the upper floors. The elevators, those vertical veins of the city, became dark, narrow tombs. The digital human was truly stranded, left to wander through a forest of steel that no longer knew how to serve its master. Yet, as the cities descended into a cacophony of fear and confusion, a different reality was taking hold in the quiet corners of the world. In a small, hillside village where the scent of wild thyme hung heavy in the air, an old man sat on his porch. His hands were thick and leathery, mapped with the scars of 1,000 seasons. He reached out and pressed the power button on his old, wooden-framed television, more out of habit than hope. He heard a dry, mechanical click, nothing more. He waited a few seconds, looked at the dark screen, and then slowly shook his head with a small, knowing smile. For him, this was not the end of the world. It was simply a return to the one he had always known. He stood up, adjusted his worn hat, and walked toward the stone well at the edge of his property. The sound of the wooden bucket descending into the dark, cool deep was the most honest sound he had heard in years. As he pulled the rope, the water that emerged was cold, clear, and vibrant, sparkling like liquid diamonds in the dying light. He carried the buckets to his garden, his movements slow and rhythmic, watering the long rows of tomatoes and peppers. His water did not require a Wi-Fi signal to reach the roots, and his fruit did not rely on a global supply chain to ripen. While the modern world panicked because it could no longer connect, the old man was more connected than ever. He was in direct conversation with the soil, and the earth was answering back with life. It is easy to look at this event as a punishment, but perhaps it was something far more profound. Perhaps the earth, in its ancient and patient wisdom, realized that we were becoming an error of nature, a species so obsessed with the virtual that we had forgotten the physical. Instead of allowing us to fade into history as a failed experiment or a technological parasite, the planet gave us a second chance. It did not wipe us out with fire or flood, it simply unplugged us. It stripped away the distractions and the noise to see if we still remembered how to be human. It was a mercy, a forced retreat back to the essentials, a pruning of the branches so that the roots might grow deep once again. In the months and years that followed, a spectacular and grueling transformation began to reshape the face of the planet. A massive migration took place, a human tide flowing in reverse. The great cities, once the beacons of progress, lost their charm as people realized that you cannot eat concrete and you cannot drink prestige. Millions began to walk away from the steel jungles, following the ancient paths toward the green horizon. They arrived in the countryside not as conquerors, but as refugees of a failed digital empire. In a desperate, beautiful act of survival, the people of the cities began to tear up the asphalt of the streets and the concrete of the parking lots. Beneath that dead, gray skin, they found the earth still waiting, still fertile, still ready to forgive. They planted cabbage where taxis used to idle and corn in the middle of abandoned intersections. The gray was slowly, relentlessly replaced by emerald green. Our ingenuity did not vanish. It merely found a new, more tactile expression. We looked back to the forgotten power of steam, refining the designs of the past with our modern understanding of mechanics. Great, majestic steam engines, crafted with precision and care, began to power the mills and local machinery once again. The sound of hissing steam and turning wooden gears replaced the high-pitched whine of the electric motor. Knowledge was no longer a fragile signal stored on a server that could be deleted. It became a physical treasure stored in the weight of books. Libraries became the most guarded cathedrals of human achievement. We rediscovered the elegance of the printed word, of hand-drawn maps, and of medical journals that didn't require a battery to save a life. The librarian and the blacksmith became the most essential members of society, one guarding the mind and the other guarding the tools of the hand. The economy returned to the tangible and the real. Physical cash, silver coins, and the ancient practice of barter regained their importance. Trade became a human connection again, a conversation, an eye-to-eye negotiation, and a firm handshake over a bag of seeds or a hand-forged plow. We realized that for generations, we had traded our precious time for digital illusions, and now, for the first time in memory, we were spending it on things we could actually hold. People who had spent their lives writing lines of code or managing invisible hedge funds found a new, visceral pride in the weight of a stone they had placed themselves in a garden wall. They discovered that there is a profound joy in knowing exactly whose hands baked the bread, whose hands sheared the sheep, and whose hands brought the harvest home. This great decoupling was not the end of our story, but its most important chapter. We lost the artificial glow of the screen so that we could see the infinite majesty of the stars once more. We lost the virtual noise to rediscover the profound value of a human voice across a dinner table. We learned that the Earth is not just a platform for our technology, but a living partner that requires our care and our presence. We have returned to a world of sun and shadow, of season and soil. We have finally returned home to the Earth, no longer as its masters, but as its students. You have been watching Insight Voyager. If the universe were to press the off button tomorrow, what would you have left to offer the world? Beyond the email addresses and the digital shadows, look at your hands and look at the soil beneath your feet. That is where our future truly begins. If this story moved you, please like the video and subscribe to our channel to join us on more journeys through the mysteries of our world. Stay curious. Stay connected with the Earth.